Good afternoon. Kudos to all of you for sticking around. This is really amazing after lunch to have so many people still awake and alert. And I want to thank the organizers. This session gets better and better every year, and I think today has just been terrific. I think you all really have been exposed to a lot of great talks and really incredibly useful information. So look forward to many more years of the ESAS Scholars Program. So I think what I'm going to contribute today to this conversation is maybe talk a little bit about how NIH establishes research priorities, how you can find out about those, how that can maybe inform you about the research you might want to do or not. So I'm also going to stick in a little bit about NIH and some very basic stuff just to help you as new investigators kind of navigate this monstrosity that is NIH, and kind of who to talk to there and when, and what kind of topics. And then we'll talk a little bit about research priorities. So we tend to think of NIH as this big behemoth, this big monolithic structure. That's our big clinical center in Bethesda. But in fact, we're a very complicated bureaucracy, and we're made up of 24 funding institutes, all split up by scientific area, disease, lifespan stage. And then there are also these three separate parts of NIH that don't have funding authority. So the 24 institutes are where the money comes from. That's where you apply to get your grant funded. But the important one down below there is the Center for Scientific Review. And so there's often confusion that, for example, NIGMS over here with a little red bar around it, that we somehow, the SAT, surgery, anesthesiology, and study section is part of us. It's not. Those are two separate entities. And I'll talk a little bit more about how these decisions are made, but it's important for you to realize that. And it's good to know that there are all these different institutes. They have different missions. They have different grants they offer. They have different eligibility criteria for certain things. So you do need to be a little strategic when you start thinking about where you want to send your grant, and I'll talk a little bit about how to get some help doing that. So the Center for Scientific Review, that's really the gateway into NIH. So every application that comes to NIH goes through the Center for Scientific Review. And that's where the majority of, when you think about study sections like SAT, those are housed within the Center for Scientific Review. Not in my institute, not in NCI, they're in the Center for Scientific Review. And they actually review about 75% of all the applications come in. And we're now something like 50,000 applications a year. You wonder why success rates aren't great? A lot of competition. So here's kind of the journey of your application. You're sitting out here at your institution. Just as an aside, I've used this slide for many years with Albert Einstein there, and I thought, it's 2018. We need a little gender equity. Does anybody recognize the woman? I hope I get a little better response than Peter got this morning with his, name that person. Anybody know? This is Barbara McClintock, who was the first woman to solely get a Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine. So, go her, for gene transposition. So anyway, I've revised my slide now. Going forward, it will stay this way. So anyway, you're out here doing all your brilliant things, coming up with wonderful ideas, and you send in an application. And it goes, as I said, to the Center for Scientific Review. And they make two simultaneous decisions at that point. And one is which institute, like NIGMS, would be the most appropriate for the science that you're proposing. And then they make a separate independent decision which study section in CSR would be most appropriate. Now there are some caveats I won't go into. Things are much more complicated than that, but by and large, that's how it works. So when people call me and they complain that your study section, SAT, it's like, no, SAT, Center for Scientific Review, independent from NIH. And in fact, there's a very deliberate separation of program and review at NIH to try to keep things very, very clean and separate. So it gets assigned to a study section. They generate, that's where peer review occurs. They generate a summary statement which has your critiques in it. I also get a copy of that summary statement. And then things go well, goes through our advisory council, which is we call it the second level of peer review. And everything goes great, you get the money, and everybody lives happily ever after till your renewal. And so here's just kind of a little quick schematic about who you contact at what point in the process. And so when you're out there coming up with ideas, you want to know if this is something the Institute's interested in, or which institute, which study section. At that point, you would contact someone like myself, a program director in the Institute, to see if that institute would accept that application or is interested in that area of science. But you can at that point also talk to the scientific review officer who runs the study section. So both of us have information that we could share with you at that point. Once it's submitted, right up until the day it's reviewed, then you're pretty much talking to the SRO, the Scientific Review Administrator. They are the one, if you have some late material you might want to submit, or you have questions about the review process, or things related directly to review, they're the ones you would talk to. After it's reviewed, pretty much the day it's reviewed, after that, then you'd be back talking to the program officer. And we'd be the one, well, actually I have another slide that says the sort of things you could talk to with us. But one thing I do want to mention, and it's kind of based on some of the things we've been hearing today, the program directors, the program officers, we're people. We have families, we have struggles, just like all of you. So I do tell people when I give a new grant, I'm like, contact me. If there's anything that's going on with you, it can be professionally or personally, that's going to potentially impact your K or your R01 or whatever, let me know. And sometimes there's actually things we can do to maybe help. So, it's never hurts to let us know what's going on. So here's some of the things you could talk to a program officer about. Before submission, it'd be obviously things like, is my topic a good fit for your institute? Is it something your institute's excited about, or do you have 100 other applications and grants on that right now and you're getting kind of tired of that topic? Institutes there's always things sort of in the works that might not be out there yet, and talk with a program officer might give you a heads up about things that are coming. Grant mechanisms, and we can certainly talk to you about study sections as well. After review, then it usually would focus on the summary statement. There's all these critiques. Which ones do I focus on? How do I submit an amended application? Or what's the funding? What does this score mean? You get this score out of context, and it's like, am I getting funded, or is there no hope? What's going on? And if not funded, then kind of what are next steps? So lots of things we can talk about, and realize this is part of our job. I mean, you're not like taking me away from other more important things when you call me. So you don't have to start off your call saying, Dr. Cole, I'm really sorry to bother you, but. But there are a few tips for when you are working with us and calling people at NIH. First of all, be prepared. I mean, do a little homework. Try to find the answer to your question on your own if you can. And there are some resources I'll tell you about where you can do some of that now. Be timely. I really hate it when people call the day before the review, their grant's getting reviewed, and say, I think it's going to the wrong study section. There's nothing we can do at that point. But if you had called me soon after it got assigned and truly we have a discussion, or you contact CSR actually at that point, things can happen. Applications can be moved if CSR agrees with that. So timeliness is important. And be specific with your questions. I mean, often people call with specific questions and then it segues to a much broader discussion, so that's fun too. And what I find works best is to, send me an email, and if it's about, is my grant appropriate for your institute, a couple of sentences about the work. If you've got an abstract, you can send that. That gives me something solid to look at. I can think about it a little more. And, if it's not appropriate for us, I can look into where maybe it should go. And then, if a phone call is needed, we'll follow up with a phone call and schedule that. Now, there's some resources I'll tell you about. I hope most of you know about the NIH Reporter. This is just a rich database of all funded grants at NIH going back many years. And so I often send young investigators to this to look up what's already funded in your area. I mean, you can do a search on terms, and I'll show you some other new tools as well. It'll tell you, which institute at NIH has been funding that kind of research. Might give you an idea about the potential collaborators and success rates. I mean, there's just tons and tons of information here. And it's worth, going in and playing with it and getting familiar with it. So one of the newest tools, which, I use this myself all the time, it's called Matchmaker. And when you go into Reporter, you can see there's a tab there. And it's got this 15,000 character entry point. You can put a whole abstract, a whole specific aims page, and what it will tell you, it reads out like this, where you can see which institute funds most of the grants in that area. Now I put in burn injury, just a little short, very targeted search. But like I said, it's more typical to go and put your whole abstract in or something like that. But you can see it shows NIGMS is the largest funder of burn injury applications, grants at NIH, which makes sense. We have a burn injury portfolio. It also shows you, what kind of grants primarily are in that area. You can see it's R01s. But the other good information, it'll show you which study sections are these applications primarily reviewed in. You can see SAT, surgery, anesthesiology, and trauma reviews most of them. And you'll also get a printout of all the grants in that area, and again, loaded with information. Now, the other thing that's very handy is you can also click on the tab for Program Official, and it'll now tell you all the program officers at NIH who work in the burn injury area or have some, I guess it's really showing you program officials who have funded grants that relate to burn injury. And again, at the top of the list is my colleague Scott Summers, who handles the burn injury portfolio. So I'm happy to see he actually came to the top of the list. And it gives you the contact information. You can click on that and you can get an email send off to Scott. So trying to identify who to talk to at NIH is much easier than it used to be. And it used to be, you kind of ask your colleagues, who do you talk to there? And some might start with one person and, work your way finally maybe to the right person. But this saves a lot of time, and it's really a nice tool. So switching gears a bit, I'll talk a little bit about, how does NIH set their priorities? And all of the institutes set their own priorities, and NIH Central has their way of setting priorities as well. And there's a lot of ways we get input into doing this. The biggest, the most important one is really the scientific community. We come to meetings like this, we listen to scientific talks, we talk to our grantees, we talk to applicants. We have members from scientific societies come to our institute and talk to us and let us know what's going on and what their needs are, where the scientific gaps might be. So that, I would say, is by large the main source of input. Now, we can't forget Congress. They're very important in all of this as well, and they in fact do set the appropriation and the budget for NIH. They can set priorities or instruct us in a number of different ways. Sometimes it's just language that's in the appropriation bill. We think, maybe you should kind of think about this or do more in this area. What we like the best is when they say things like that, but actually give us money to do it. And that's less common. But for example, this year, if you've been reading and paying attention to it, we did get money for the opioid crisis and research related to that, as well as for Alzheimer's research. So there are opportunities there right now in those areas. And then third, there's a lot of other places, people from industry, patient advocacy groups, public representatives. These people come and serve on our advisory panels, and so we're always hearing from them as well, and they offer, another perspective. So those are, I would say, by and large, the main sources of input that we use to think about our own priorities. So how do you find out about this? The simplest way is if we develop an area that we want to see, if we have an area we want to see developed, we issue funding opportunity announcements, and that's our way of saying, here's an area, please send in an application. And those are usually as a program announcement or an RFA, a request for application. I won't get into how those are different, but now these, whenever one of these comes out, it is posted in the NIH Guide for Grants and Contracts. You can subscribe to that. If you have a good grants office, they should be kind of monitoring these things as well, and they might have ways of informing their investigators at their institution. But you can subscribe yourself. There's a lot of stuff that's generally not relevant. There's lots of policy changes. There's lots of kind of administrative minutia, but buried in there could be an opportunity for you that might be useful. Now, every one of those 24 institutes has a website. Now, obviously, you can't be monitoring 24 institutes' websites, but some of us have blogs where you can subscribe to them, and anytime we have an opportunity coming up, like right now, there's some money for equipment supplements for our current grantees. That's in our blog. It is not being done as a special program announcement, so the only way you'd know about it was through the NIH Guide, where it was announced, and through our blog. So that's worth subscribing to. So you have to strategically figure out which institutes, multiple institutes, might be most relevant to you, and maybe kind of keep an eye on either their blogs or their website. Now, there is a way to get an early peek at initiatives that might be coming from the institutes, and that's to read the minutes for the advisory council. Any initiative that we're going to issue, a new program announcement or an RFA, has to get cleared by our advisory councils. And so there's a process for that, and it has to get written up in the minutes. And they're public record, and they're on our websites, and they're actually really easy to find. And if you read through them, you can see something called a concept clearance. So here's an example of one I took from NINDS. And this came out last year, and this happened to be in this topic of neurobiology of small blood and lymphatic vessels. But you probably can't, this type is too small, but what it does is it identifies a program person who has presented this initiative to council, and it says very little bit about it, but down here it says 2 funding announcements were proposed for publication in mid-October. So council approved these. So what this tells you is here it is May, and there's going to be some program announcement coming out on this in October. You're getting like 5 months heads up on something that's coming. Now, if this isn't in your area, obviously you ignore it, but if it's a topic, that's relevant to you, you can contact this program person now. This is now out there, public record, and ask her, what's the plan? Tell me anything about these announcements that are going to be coming out. Now, Emory did a much better job on this than I could ever do, so this was good that I followed you, Emory. But just a little bit about selecting a project sort of with NIH in mind. So we've talked about NIH requested research. In other words, when we issue things and say, please send us applications in this area, and I program announcements, RFAs. We have strategic plans you can read about and other announcements. But actually the majority of research and a majority of applications that come to NIH are investigator initiated. It means it's nothing we put out there to say apply to. It's just you having a great idea and sending it in to us. So, there doesn't have to be a program announcement or an RFA out there for you to submit your work. And the majority, like I said, comes in this way. And you've heard this before, and I think this is really important. Find what research excites you. When you write an application, really what you're trying to do is get the reviewers excited about your topic and your research. And believe me, if you're not excited about it, it's going to come across in your application, and the reviewers are not going to be excited about it. And I think this was already mentioned by several of the speakers. Really think about the gaps that exist in your specialty. And, Emery pointed out some great ideas about identifying, just things that are sort of standard and you do sort of automatically. That's kind of a clue for, where are their needs. And coming to meetings like this, you get a lot of ideas. And certainly from the reviewer perspective, they're really looking for work that's going to move the field forward. That's what they care about. They're looking for impact. Now, that can be in basic science. It doesn't have to have immediate clinical impact, but it needs to have impact in your field and somehow moving it forward. So these are just a few of the resources. There really is, I know we're all busy people, and you guys are super busy trying to balance research and clinical, but there are a lot of resources out there for you, and some of them are very quick. You don't have to spend a lot of time. The Center for Scientific Review has got a nice quick little video about the review process. I think the more you know about it, the more effective you can be writing an application. The Office of Extramural Research goes step by step through a lot of the application process. And I send people a lot to this site. NIAID Allergy and Infectious Disease really puts a lot of energy into maintaining a really terrific grants tutorial website. And they go through everything. I mean, how to write your specific aims page. They have sample applications for you to look at. How do you plan a budget and your personnel? So I really recommend that site, especially if you're, well, really at any time. Anybody can benefit this. It's really, really well done. And so I think there are a lot of resources, but probably at NIH your best resource is the people. I mean, I spend a lot of time on the phone with especially new investigators, because you have a lot to learn, and it's, there are great resources, but ultimately it really helps to talk to somebody, on the inside who can, help you be more effective in submitting your applications and getting those precious K awards and research grants. So with that, I will stop and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes for questions. Any questions? All right, Liz?
I have a quick question. I was hoping Dr. Cole could comment on the early career reviewer program that the NIH does for the site.
Oh, thank you for bringing that up. So, again, not that you're not all really, really busy, but, there's nothing like getting hands-on experience. And CSR started a program a number of years ago where they invite young investigators. I'm trying to think what the requirement is. If I'm trying to think, maybe you do have to have an R01. No, you don't have to have an R01, right? To come on, to sit on the review panel, you have a very minimal review load, and it's just for the one round. So you can self-nominate. If you go to the CSR website, just early stage investigator CSR, early stage investigator, you'll go right to it. And you can nominate yourself, or other people can nominate you. It is very competitive, because I think people have realized this is a really nice program, and you learn so much from sitting there and listening to, experienced investigators review grants. We're also starting at our institute a early stage investigator on our council. Now that you do have to have an R01, but you're like an ESI, an early stage investigator, like you just got your R01, to come and see what happens to grants after the peer review. What's that next stage of review? So I think NIH is trying to engage young investigators more and give you opportunities. So definitely, thanks for bringing that up. That's a nice program.
Jim?
Yeah, quick question for Dr. Cole. Regarding the suggestion that you had of if you think your study has been malassigned to a study section, explicitly, we're all weary of potentially inflaming somebody by saying the wrong thing to an SRO, right?
Right.
How exactly do you think we should approach that? It seems like, with anesthesiology, this is from the Department of Anesthesiology, this goes to SAT, right?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily, but it seems like that happens,
Right.
frequently from
Right.
good folks over there that are very busy processing 50,000 applications. So how would you approach that explicitly? Start at the SRO, start with the SRO at the study section you want to send it to. Exactly how would you go about this?
So first of all, when you send in the application, there's a form you can actually request or suggest a study section. And CSR does look at those requests, suggestions, whatever, and try to honor them if they make sense, okay? So that's first, preemptively, before it even comes in the door, you can try that. Now, if it does come in and it goes to a study section you don't think is really the proper one, first of all, do your homework, look up that study section, look at its charge, and look at the roster, make sure you're right that it's not the best place. And then, yes, you'd contact the SRO for the one where it's assigned right now, and just start the discussion. You don't have to be inflammatory, but just say, I'm kind of confused. Could you explain? And honestly, SROs by and large, want you to be happy with where it's getting reviewed. Again, if it makes sense and it's, the scientific expertise is there. Because if you're not happy with it, darn, if that summary statement comes back and you get a bad score, it's because it went to the wrong study section, right? So as much as they can, if your recommendation or suggestion scientifically makes sense, they try to abide by that. But yeah, call the SRO, start the discussion.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for great talks. Alison, this is actually something I think I've asked you before, but I thought it'd be instructive. So if you already get a grant from a certain institute, like NIGMS, to what extent do you tend to stay in that institute in your subsequent applications, and in particular when there's a funding announcement that's sponsored by, say, other institutes? Like, how much can you move between institutes? And does an institute have an incentive to sort of keep you and fund you later?
Oh, and it gets worse than that. There's specific program directors within the institute who want to keep certain investigators. No, it's driven by the science. And it's not uncommon, especially GM being, a lot of what we support is very basic research in addition to our clinical areas. So often people will start with us, but then, they find something about their basic science that actually has an application to the eye or to the elderly, and suddenly they have an application, to send somewhere else. And that's fine. We actually, encourage that. NIGMS does, I would say over the last several years, is very conscious about total other support. You guys at this stage, you're not worried about that. You're worried about getting your first grant. But we're trying, I think, to take limited resources and spread them around as far as we can to improve success rates. And so, we do, for established investigators, really keep an eye on the other support. And that, includes grants to other institutes and other agencies as well. But you all don't have to worry about that yet.
Maybe one more question?
We do have one more question. Thank you both for a wonderful presentation. I have a question that I think pertains to a lot of young people. I review grants for some of the foundations as well as for SAT. And that is, Emery in particular mentioned the importance of getting training, and new skills. But a lot of young people are now doing, team-based science. And some of those skills are very difficult to acquire. I'll give, the example of machine learning would be a good one, or high-level statistical analysis. How critical is it for the newbie PI or the up-and-coming ambitious PI to have that skill, have mastery of that skill on their own versus collaborate with somebody who can bring that skill in and add another key personnel to their grant?
I think it's a really good question because, and I think it's a normative decision. I think you have to decide where do you want your expertise to lie going forward. So if you say like, oh, I've become totally enamored of machine learning and I really want to build a career, doing the sorts of things like, Jeff Balzer was talking about today, then, getting a master's, maybe even getting a PhD, that's, I think, very, very reasonable to do. However, if you've decided that, you're going to be the maven for understanding what factors predict peri-operative risk for patients having anesthesia and surgery, and you realize that you have the insights of what the main things are, then getting some basic training in machine learning and then getting the machine learning unit at your institute or collaborators, I think, is really the way to do. The compelling thing in a grant is that you have to make clear that all the expertise you need is covered. And if you say, if I don't have it, he does or she does. And I think once you do that, and it's very clear, oh, everything is layered out, you're totally good. I think that the key thing, though, is that the reason I mentioned the new training is that you say, oh, I'm going to turn the corner. I'm going to start becoming a clinician scientist now. And you use, because that's where I see myself over the next 10, 15 years, going. And so then there I think you really want to consider training deeply.
Well, thank you very much.